Okay, so the topic today, class, would be PAS 16, the standard that governs your property, plant, and equipment. So this would be the standard that we will apply when we are dealing with assets that will be classified as your property, plant, and equipment. So the first question you would have to ask would be, what assets then would be classified as an item of property, plant, and equipment? And PAS 16 gives us the definition for assets that would be considered as a property, plant, and equipment. We will be able to go over the definition as we continue in our discussion later on, class. But I would just like to direct your attention to the objective, class. It's very simple. Okay, this standard prescribes the accounting treatment for property, plant, and equipment, also known as PPE for short, so that the users of the financial statements can discern information about an entity's investment in its property, plant, and equipment, including the changes in such investment. There's nothing peculiar here, class. This is a very basic statement. But I would just like to lead your attention, class, to the use of the word investment here. Because an acquisition on the part of an entity of an item of property, plant, and equipment, class, is again considered as an investment activity. If you'll recall in the discussion on past 7, class, the standard and the statement of cash flows, you'll remember that for changes for transactions involving cash flows in your property, plant, and equipment, class, they would be considered as an investing activity. So I hope when you read this part of the standard, class, you were able to see, or you were able to find the connection. Okay, and the objective here, class, of this, as stated in the standard, tries to lead your attention, class, as to what are the important things that you ought to learn from this standard, class. Okay, and the standard tells us that the principal issues in accounting for property, plant, and equipment are, number one, the recognition of the assets. So PAS 16 will tell us what conditions must be present for an entity to recognize an asset as an item of property, plant, or equipment. Second, the determination of their carrying amount, which would involve the determination of the measurement of the asset, both the initial measurement and subsequent measurement. There are different rules for the initial measurement of an item of PPE and for its subsequent measurement. Initial measurement meaning the measurement that would be given to the PPE, to the property, plant, and equipment upon its initial recognition, upon its first entry in our records or our book. Subsequent would be everything after the initial measurement. Third would be the depreciation charges. As you should have already encountered in your basic accounting class, items of PPE are depreciable assets, and you will have to recognize depreciation charges every year throughout the life of the PPE. Later on, we will learn that an item of PPE must have a useful life of more than 1 year. And applying the matching principle, class, it is incorrect to recognize as an expense the entire cost of an item of PPE. So applying matching principle, you will have to spread out. You will have to spread out the cost of the PPE over the periods in which the PPE is able to provide economic benefits to the entity. That's basically the rationale or logic behind the use of depreciation. If we do not use depreciation, class, to slowly and gradually charge the cost of the asset as an expense, then the only option would be to recognize the entire value paid for the PPE as an expense. But if you do that, then your expenses for the year of acquisition would be very high. Okay, and you will not be able to match the cost and the revenues. Basically, we use, or there is the use of depreciation, class, following the matching principle. Okay, and that's the third focus of PAS 16. The fourth would be impairment losses. Okay, we will also be discussing the definition of what an impairment loss is later on. Okay, as to the scope, class, the standard tells us that the standard shall be applied in accounting for property, plant, and equipment, except when another standard requires or permit a different accounting treatment. And this is already repetitive on your part, class, and this is actually self-explanatory. Of course, the standard will be applied only to items of property, plant, and equipment. Okay, but I want you to take note, class, that PAS 16, just like PAS 2, class, is for general application. And you should notice that the items to which PAS 2 and PAS 16 do not apply are those items to which a different standard, a more specific standard, is available. What do I mean? If you look at the paragraph 3, class, it tells you as to what items the standard will not apply, as to what items PAS 16 will not apply. And you have here, for example, an item of PPE actually, but which is already classified as held for sale. It will no longer be under PAS 16, but it will now be under PFRS 5. Okay, you have your biological assets, which would be covered by PAS 41. You have your exploratory assets, your wasting assets, which again would be discussed later on after midterms. Okay, you will have to apply PFRS 6. Okay, so the point here is you will rarely be tested, class, to identify whether one is under PAS 16 or not. Okay, the question would most likely be which of the following is not covered by PAS 16. Okay, very rare, class, very rare in which you would be asked, is this item of PPE part of PAS 16? Because more often than not, the answer would be yes. So the focus on most difficult questions or tricky questions would be to determine or identify what item is not covered by PAS 16. Okay. Again, as I mentioned earlier, PAS 16 would be for general application. If a particular asset falls under the definition of a property, plant, and equipment, then automatic it would be PAS 16, unless if there is a specific standard that governs specifically for very specific type of asset. Okay. Again, as far as your examinations are concerned, one good question here would be from paragraph 3 would be which of the following is not covered by PAS 16, and you will just be given an example, other examples of an item of PPE, and the answer would be either of the 4 items enumerated in this paragraph. Okay, and by the time you will be done with all the other standards, class, that would no longer be a difficult question. Once you have already encountered PFRS 5, 6, and PAS 41, then you would be able to answer easily, class, that this item, this asset is not covered by PAS 16 because this is covered by another standard. But at this point, since you are not yet familiar with the other standards, class, this would be a good source for a tricky question. Okay. And by the way, there will also be other questions, class, especially for computational questions, for computational problems later on in your other accounting subjects, when you will be simply asked, compute for the total property, plant, and equipment, and all that will be given in the problem would be a list of assets, class. You'll be given a list of assets with the corresponding amount, and all you have to do would be to identify or determine whether which of the enumeration given in the problem will constitute an item of property, plant, and equipment. And you will have to be guided by the definition provided in PAS 16. And once you are able to determine or identify, class, which items enumerated in the problem will be considered as a property, plant, and equipment, all you have to do would be to add all of them. And you will already be able to answer the question, how much would be the total property, plant, and equipment. The reason why I am bringing that up, it's because it's very important for you to be able to know the definition of PPE for the purpose of knowing what items, what assets will be considered as part of your property, plant, and equipment. Okay. Please take note that PAS 16 applies to PPE used to develop or maintain the assets described in the other exclusions. Okay, so if you have other items of PPE, class, that are used in relation to enumeration B, C, and D, then that would still be part of your PAS 16. Okay, very specific ang exclusions provided in paragraph 3. But I doubt if that would be a source of a question in your examinations. Okay. We'll skip paragraph 5. We'll just expound on it when we discuss past 40 on investment property. So let's proceed to definitions, class. Okay. The first item being defined here, class, are your bearer plants. Okay, this tells us that a bearer plant is a living plant that is used in the production or supply of agricultural produce that is expected to bear produce for more than one period, and it has a remote likelihood of being sold as agricultural produce. Okay, and the takeaway here, class, is that a bearer plant is to be classified as an item of PPE. Okay, but before going that, class, okay, it's important for you to remember and take note that only a living plant may be considered as a bearer plant. Okay, I know this is not confusing on your part. This is very obvious. If we're talking about a bearer plant, then it should only be a living plant. But why am I emphasizing this one? Because there are a lot of confusion in the part of the students class between a biological asset class and a bearer plant. Okay, your biological assets class would either be a plant or an animal. Okay, we will discuss biological assets more when we discuss past 41. But what I am telling you right now is that biological assets may either be a plant or an animal. Okay, and in the discussion on biological assets class, there would be a lot of questions wherein you would be asked, is this asset a biological asset or an item of PPE? Okay, because if you are a biological asset class, then that means you are going to be separately recognized from the other items of property, plant, and equipment. Now here comes bearer plant class. Students would automatically think that if it is a plant or an animal class, automatic it is a biological asset. Okay, that is wrong. But what did I say earlier? I said that only plants and animals can be biological assets. I did not say that all plants and animals will have to be classified as a biological asset. Okay, so what does that mean? It is possible, class, that a plant class may either be classified, or even an animal class. A plant or an animal may be considered as a PPE, and it could also be classified as a biological asset. Okay? Please do not think that automatic, if it is a plant or an animal that is owned by the entity, automatic it is going to be classified as a biological asset. Okay? Again, plants and animals can be considered as PPE as well. The distinction, class, would now fall on the purpose. Okay? For what use is the entity holding this plant or animal? For what use is this entity owning this plant or animal? Okay? And when we go over the definition of your biological assets later on, and your property, plant, and equipment, you'll be able to know that depending upon the use, a plant or an animal may be considered as an item of PPE or biological assets. Okay, but because, class, the bearer plant class is more of an exemption on the classification of your plants and animals. Okay, if you cannot remember, class, if you cannot remember everything I'm talking right now, it would be safe for you to remember that biological plants and animals would generally be classified as biological assets. And the bearer plant classification class is more of an exemption. And the problem now is some students would think, oh, there is an exemption on plants and animals that it can be considered as a bearer plant. They would try to extend it, class. They would try to extend it on animals. Okay. The definition of bearer plant is obviously only for plants, class. Okay. Let's an example, class, would be for your hands, class. Let's say the reason that you how do you call this? the reason that you have a poultry class, that um, you have hens is for the purpose of laying eggs. Okay, following the logic here, class. Following the logic here, the purpose is just to be used in the production or supply of agricultural produce, class. Then you might think uh, perhaps the laying hens will not actually be biological assets because its purpose is not for the is not for us to manage its growth, but for it to produce an agricultural produce. So you might have that an idea and think that it can be considered as a bearer animal, but again, there's no such thing. Okay, I may have overemphasized already, but my point really here is that bearer plants is limited only uh, to plants class. Okay, I apologize if I have overcomplicated it. I'm just trying to inform you or to advise you as to what you should avoid thinking incorrectly. Okay. Uh, so just to go over biological assets class, an entity holds biological assets with the intention of profiting from a plant or animal's ability to grow and multiply. As I mentioned earlier, if our concern is in the management or growth, in the management of the growth of a biological asset, whether a plant or animal, then it would be classified as a biological asset. Okay. But if an entity is not interested in a living plant's ability to grow class, but is rather interested only in its ability to produce other products, then it shall be considered as a bearer plant. Okay. That's where the distinction lies. If your concern is on the plant's ability to produce agricultural produce, then that would be a bearer plant. If your concern is on the ability on the growth class of that particular plant, then that would be considered as a biological asset. Okay, let me just give you an example. Okay, we have coconut trees. If we are maintaining the coconut trees class for the purpose of producing coconut, then it does not matter how long or wide the trunk grows class. We will not monitor the growth in the length and in the width class, since their only purpose is to produce coconut. And in such case, then the trees will not be considered as a biological asset, but only a bearer plant. Another example class would be the vines for grapes. The vine itself class will not be considered as a biological asset since we are not concerned as to its growth or how far the vine extends. Our concern is on the vine's ability to produce grapes, which is our agricultural product. Okay. So again, on the intention, the purpose or the use for the plant or animal. Okay, but going back to the coconut tree class, if the entity changes its mind and decides to get lumber class from the coconut tree, then the tree may then be reclassified from being a bearer plant, which is an item of PPE. It can now be reclassified as a biological asset. Okay, so it is possible class for a plant to start as a PPE, to start as a property, plant, and equipment, being a bearer plant, and later on reclassified as a biological asset. Now you might ask the question, why do we spend so much time discussing the distinction between a biological asset and property, plant, and equipment? The main reason is that if your classification is incorrect, then that means you will be using the wrong or incorrect measurement. The measurement rules class for PPE is different from biological assets. Okay, biological assets are measured at fair value, while property, plant, and equipment are initially measured at cost and subsequently measured using the cost model or the revaluation model. We will discuss more on those models later on. Okay, let's just focus on the definitions first. Okay. So basically that's it class. A bearer plant is only a plant. It is not going to be reported as a biological asset, but as an item of your property, plant, and equipment. Okay. Just an interesting trivia class. Zoo animals, and this is a common question. This is commonly asked. What's the classification of zoo animals? Okay. Again, if you follow your our simple rule class that if it is a plant or animal automatic, it's biological asset, then you would be giving a wrong answer. Remember, if we're talking about zoo animals class, are you interested in the growth, in the weight of the animals? The answer is no. The animals are just there regardless of how they grow class. Okay, their use is more for recreational. And in such case class, such animal will be considered as a property, plant, and equipment. Why is that interesting? Because again, many students would just jump to the conclusion that if it's an animal automatic, it's a biological asset. That's wrong. Okay, again, you inquire as to its use. You inquire as to the intention of the entity in acquiring or in holding the asset. Okay. Here you have the definition of cost class. Cost is the amount of cash or cash equivalent paid or the fair value of the other consideration given to acquire an asset at the time of acquisition. This is important class because this is a common question. Which of the following describes cost? And all you have to do is to remember the definition provided in the standard. By the way, let's just go over carrying amount as well. Carrying amount is the amount at which an asset is recognized after deducting any accumulated depreciation and accumulated impairment losses. If you have encountered carrying amount in the other standards class, you would notice that this is slightly different because here it includes the provision for depreciation and impairment. And you would understand that this is applicable because of the nature of your property, plant, and equipment. And that is, it is a long-term asset. Property, plant, and equipment are long-term assets. Okay. Other important definitions class, depreciable amount and depreciation. Okay, it's very important for you to remember the definition of these items, especially depreciation class. This comes out in the examinations quite often. Okay, so please remember the definitions provided here. Now, impairment. Okay, this is very important class. You will be encountering this in a lot of situations. Okay, let's just start with the definition. Very basic. An impairment loss is the amount by which the carrying amount of an asset exceeds its recoverable amount. Okay, so basically you are comparing two things here. You are comparing the carrying amount and the recoverable amount. Okay, so the question would always be, is the asset impaired and by how much? Okay, to answer the first question, an asset is impaired class if the recoverable amount is lower than the carrying amount. The actual value that we will be able to get from the asset is lower than the amount by which the asset is carried in the books. And we do not allow our records to remain that way, class. We do not allow our records of our assets to be greater than the amount that we will be able to ultimately recover the asset from the assets, because it would lead to a misleading information. Okay? Financial statement users would think that the company is worth this much by looking at the carrying amount, when in reality, the amount that we will ultimately recover from the asset is already significantly lower. And in that case, you will have to bring down your values class. Okay, so basically, past 16 class is the first time that you are formally introduced to impairment. Okay, most account balances of assets in our accounting records class are to be measured using historical or original cost. If you'll remember your inventories class, they are also to be initially measured and recorded at historical or original cost. Okay, and considering that when we use the cost model class, there will be no fluctuations in its value, it is entirely possible that the carrying amount of an asset will no longer represent its true value class. Okay, and this can happen both ways. Okay, the carrying amount can be higher than the recoverable amount. The carrying amount can also be lower than the recoverable amount. But the impairment loss class only arises when the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. Now, again, this can be confusing on the part of the students because there are two ways of looking at it. By focusing on the carrying amount, or by focusing on the recoverable amount. So if your focus is on the carrying amount, there is an impairment loss if the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. If you focus on recoverable amount, there is an impairment loss if the recoverable amount is lower than the carrying amount. Okay, it's just a perception class depending on from where you are looking at it. But what is important is that we want our financial statement users not to be uh, misled. Okay, the carrying amount class again may be higher or lower than its current value or its fair value. We only have an issue on impairment if the scenario involves carrying amount that is higher than the recoverable amount. Inversely, a scenario wherein the recoverable amount is lower than the carrying amount. Okay, we recognize impairment losses to remedy the scenario. To remedy the scenario wherein the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. In case the recoverable amount is higher class, then we don't have to do anything. Okay, just leave the reported values as they are. There is no need for us to recognize the supposed gain. Okay, some would think of it, class, as a gain because the value that you have reported is lower than the amount that you will ultimately recover. But again, we do nothing, class. We do nothing if the recoverable amount is higher than the carrying amount. Okay. There is only a need for us to do something in case of impairment. In case carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, because it has a negative impact which may again affect the way the financial statement users assess our financial condition. Okay. If impairment is not recognized, class, again, people may erroneously believe that the company's financial position is stable. Okay, just because the carrying amounts are high, even though in reality the value of the assets, their recoverable amounts are already low or continues to be low. On the other hand, class, in cases where the recoverable amount is higher, nothing is again to be done because no harm befalls the financial statement users when they are not made aware that the recoverable amount of the assets reported by the entity are already very high. Okay, just look at it from the perspective of the financial statement users. There's really nothing wrong if the financial statement users will not know that the recoverable amount from our assets would actually be higher than the amount for which they are reported in our financial statements. Okay. Let's proceed to recoverable amount first, class, before going to the definition of your property, plant, and equipment. Recoverable amount is the higher between an asset's fair value less cost to sell and the fair value, fair value less cost to sell and the value in use. Okay. There are two ways, class, for us to recover the value of an asset, class. Number one, through sale. If you will sell an asset, then you are able to recover the value of the asset from the sale proceeds. Second is from the continued use of the asset, class. Okay, from the continued use of the asset. Okay, in this way, we may not be receiving cash, class, from the use of the asset, but remember that we are able to derive benefits from the asset class, not just from receiving cash from it, but also from the use that we are able to derive from it. So please expand your understanding as to how value may be recovered from an asset class. There are two ways. Number one, through sale or disposal, and that should be understandable. If you sell it, class, if you sell it, then you will definitely be able to recover something in the form of cash or money, class. Second way of recovering the value of the asset class is through continued use. Okay, just think of your equipment. You do not expect to recover the value of the amount that you have paid for the equipment from getting cash from it, class. How do we expect to recover the value or the cost of the asset? By the benefit we get from using the asset. Okay, and that is why the definition for recoverable amount, class, contemplates two values. Okay, the recoverable amount is either the fair value less cost to sell and its value in use. And this is where it gets confusing on the part of the students class. Supposedly, the first question again that you would be asked is when is an asset considered to be impaired? And as what we have discussed earlier, it's very easy. Just compare the carrying amount and the recoverable amount. Just compare the carrying amount and the recoverable amount. When is there impairment? If the carrying amount is greater or the recoverable amount is lower. But why would students find it confusing? Because the problem will not always give you just these two amounts. The problem will not just give you the carrying amount and the recoverable amount. The problem will sometimes ask you to determine the recoverable amount. And how will the problem do that? It will give you either the fair value less cost to sell and the value in use. Okay, so you will have to be the one to determine first which one will I use as the recoverable amount in comparing it with the carrying amount. Okay, but again, supposedly the definition is very simple. Which is the recoverable amount? If you're presented between the fair value less cost to sell and the value in use, which one is the recoverable amount? Whichever is higher. Okay, because the logical way of approaching this is if the value that you will be able to recover is greater when you continue to use the asset, then you continue to use the asset. But if the value that you will be able to recover from the asset is higher if you sell it, then you sell it plus. Okay. So again, first question, when is the asset impaired? An asset is impaired if carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. Or stated differently, an asset is impaired if recoverable amount is lower than the carrying amount. Okay. But why would that be confusing to some students? Because problems will not always tell you just these two amounts. Problems will sometimes ask you to determine which one is the recoverable amount. And what are your choices? What are your choices? Just choose between the fair value less cost to sell and the value in use. And you choose whichever is higher. And again, it can be very confusing, class. Because sometimes, let's say fair value less cost to sell is higher than the carrying amount. Okay, please visualize this scenario, class. Let's have amounts for you to be able to visualize easier, class. The carrying amount, class, is 200,000. The carrying amount is 200,000. The fair value less cost to sell, I forgot how much I said for carrying amount. Did I say 200,000?
Yes, sir.
Yes, attorney.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's say the carrying amount is 200,000. Okay. What if the fair value less cost to sell is 250,000? What if the fair value less cost to sell is 250,000? While the value in use is 150,000. Okay. The carrying amount is 200,000. The fair value less cost to sell is 250,000. The value in use is 150,000. And the question lang is very simple. Is the asset impaired? The answer is no. Why is the asset impaired? Sorry, why is the asset not impaired? Because the recoverable amount is higher than the carrying amount. Why was I able to say that the recoverable amount was higher? Why was I able to say that the recoverable amount was higher? Because between the 250,000 fair value less cost to sell and the value in use of 150,000, the recoverable amount is the higher between the two. And which one is the higher? The 250 or the 150? Obviously, it's the 250,000. And it is the 250,000 that will be compared to the carrying amount of 200,000. Okay? So in that case, the asset is not impaired because the recoverable amount, which is the fair value less cost to sell in this case, is higher than the carrying amount. Notwithstanding, class, that the value in use is lower than the carrying amount. Okay? That's the scenario that would confuse students. No problem if everything is higher than the carrying amount. Students will not get confused with the fact that the asset is not impaired. Okay? But again, the question that is always going to be asked is the asset impaired? You only need two things to answer this one, and that is the carrying amount and the recoverable amount. If the recoverable amount is not given outright, then you will have to determine it yourself. And the recoverable amount is either the fair value less cost to sell or the value in use. And you choose the higher between the two amounts. And the higher between the two will be the amount that will be compared to your carrying amount. Okay. But why would still this be a difficult topic, class? Why is this still a difficult topic? Because when you will be dealing later on, class, with computational problems already, computational questions, you will have to solve for these items, class. Okay. In theory, we just need to compare carrying amount and recoverable amount. And in determining our recoverable amount, we will just have to choose between value in use and fair value less cost to sell. But I'm telling you, when you will now be dealing with computational questions, class, none of these will be given outright. You will have to solve for carrying amount. You will have to solve for recoverable amount by computing first for the fair value less cost to sell and the value in use. This is a difficult topic because everything will not be given to you. But in theory, this should be very simple. You just need to compare your carrying amount and your recoverable amount. Okay. Now, I mentioned that there are two ways of being able to recover the value of the asset class, and we said that they are represented by the fair value less cost to sell and the value in use. Okay, the two ways of recovering the value is either by sale or disposal, or second, by continually using the asset class. Okay. When we talk about selling the asset class, then we are going to be using the fair value less cost to sell. If we're talking about continually using the asset, then we are going to be talking about value in use. Okay, I will talk more about value in use in the other standards class. Now let's proceed to the definition for your property, plant, and equipment class. Okay, property, plant, and equipment are, number one, they must be tangible assets class. Okay, there is a different kind of asset class which are being used similar to your property, plant, and equipment, but they will not be considered as property, plant, and equipment because they are not tangible. Okay, and I am talking about your intangible assets class. And intangible assets are governed by PAS 38, which will also be part of our subject. Okay, but that will be after midterms already. Okay, aside from focusing on A and B here, class, please remember that property, plant, and equipment must be tangible, class. Okay, that's the first important part of the definition of your property, plant, and equipment. Second is that they must be held for use in the production or supply of goods or services. So letter A here, class, is basically telling us as to the purpose, class. Okay, it should be used in production for rental or for administrative purposes, class. Okay. Going back to biological assets, as I have told you, okay, a plant or an animal may be classified as either biological asset or PPE depending upon its use. Okay, so it's very important for you to determine or remember the use for items that will be classified as property, plant, and equipment. Okay, and what are these possible uses, class? Use in the production or supply of goods and services, used for rental to others, and third, for administrative purposes. So if an potential property, plant, and equipment is being used for any of these three uses, class, then it can be an item of property, plant, and equipment. And second, class, is that it must be used for more than one period, expected to be used for more than one period. Okay, it's not enough, class, that it is used for production or supply of goods or services. It is not enough that it is used for rental. It is not enough that it is used for administrative purposes. It must also have a useful life of more than 1 year. It must be expected to be used for more than 1 year. Okay. And from this class, considering that property, plant, and equipment must be used, must have an expected use of more than 1 year, then that will tell us, class, that property, plant, and equipment are going to be classified as an item of, is to be classified as a non-current asset. Okay, please remember that is to be classified as a non-current asset. This is very important. A lot of questions will revolve around that question. Compute for the total non-current assets. So automatic, everything in the enumeration that is an item of PPE will be classified as a non-current asset. Okay. Now, let me just wrap up everything, class. If you have any takeaways from what we have discussed so far, class, if you have a takeaway from what we have discussed so far, number one, please remember the definition for your barrier plants, and please remember that barrier plants are governed by PAS 16 and not by PAS 41. Okay. Second, the definition for your depreciable amount and your depreciation. Third, please remember as to when an asset is considered to be impaired. And again, very simple, it is impaired if the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. Fourth, remember as to what will be used as recoverable amount. It is either your fair value less cost to sell if the asset is sold or disposed, or its value in use if the asset is continually used until the end of its useful life. Okay. And last takeaway would be for the definition of your property, plant, and equipment. Three things to remember. Number one, it must be a tangible asset. Second, its use must be either for use in the production or supply of goods or services, or for rental to others, or for administrative purposes. And third, it is expected to be used for more than one period. Okay. And in conjunction with the last requirement or last part of the definition of PPE, class, please remember that items of PPE are classified as non-current assets. Okay.